we come to a third vision. Depending on how you understand the visions, it may not be the actual third vision that Ezekiel has. He has many visions in this book, but it's the third of the 5 visions that we are going to look at in this series. It's a vision given to the prophet Ezekiel at a very important stage in the life of God's people. And in order to understand what is going on in this book and what God is saying through these visions, we have to understand what is happening in the greater life of God's people at the time when Ezekiel was alive. I mentioned that we would get into this last week. I said we would get into this. Well, this is the week we're going to do it. And so the nutshell of what's going on here is God's original plan for the people of Israel. One of the reasons why God made this promise to Abraham to bless all of his descendants, and also why God then rescued the people out of bondage in Egypt, slavery in Egypt, and helped them to build a nation in this new promised land that they had been given, is for a mission. God chose the people of Israel to be a people that lived differently from the nations around them, from all the other people around them in the world, so that they would draw attention. They would attract people's attention to them, and they would see how they call on the name of the Lord and trust in the name of the Lord for the provision of their food through the rains, and for defense against their enemies when their enemies would seek to come and attack them and swallow up their land into greater empires. And that all of this would be a testimony to everybody else in the world that the one true God is the God of Israel. And that they would then be attracted, and they would want to know this God, and that would then open the gate or prepare the way for God to then fully include the entire human race in his heavenly family. The trouble is the Israelites are no different than any other type of human being. They're just as stupid and they're just as wicked as all the rest of us are. And so over time, they came to the conclusion, the erroneous conclusion, that all the blessings that they had been given and all the protection that they were enjoying and their chosenness by God is because they are just, in those days, it's not true anymore, but they believed in those days that it was because they are just simply a better race of human beings. That all of the other nations around them had less dignity than dogs, and were not to be associated with in any way, shape, or form, and that it was almost kind of taking credit for God's own protection, saying, "Well, yeah, of course God's going to protect us because we're better people." That transformed then into a seeking and relying upon their own talents, their own wisdom, their own intelligence, their own military might, their own political skills of political intrigue on the international stage to keep them safe. And as time went by, they also imported other gods. They said, "Well, you know, we're better people. We can do anything we want to, and so we're going to worship other gods." And so under the rules of the wicked kings, most of the kings in Israel's history were bad kings. And one of the things that made them bad was that they encouraged the people and they empowered the people and they led the people to import the worship of foreign gods into their midst. So by the time of Ezekiel, Israel had split into 2 nations. I mentioned this last week, but I got the names wrong, and you'll see why. The northern kingdom retained the name Israel. I got it wrong last week. The northern kingdom retained the traditional name of Israel, but they had a different capital, a new capital of their own, whereas the southern kingdom took the name Judah, but they retained the traditional capital of Jerusalem. And so, one can be forgiven for getting the names backwards a little bit. But by the time of Ezekiel, basically every king after good King Josiah had led and administered and lived personally in a manner that exhorted the people to do, as the text says, do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. And you can read all about it if you want to in 2 Kings chapters 23 through 25. That the result of all of this was, for the southern kingdom of Judah, is that they first fell under the thumb of the Egyptian empire This is not when they were enslaved. Like the Egyptian Empire once again waxed strong and kind of came and took them over. And then shortly after that, the Babylonian Empire came into being, and as they increased their territorial strength, they came and they conquered the southern kingdom of the people of God, and they set up the Israelite kings. They didn't disrupt the Davidic line, but they set up the following kings to be their vassals or puppets, to be imperial puppets or vassals. And there was a small deportation then. The great Babylonian exile actually happened in two waves. And this is important because Ezekiel's right in the middle of it. That the first wave of deportation was a very small number of the Judean nobility. And they were taken away and housed in Babylonia to basically be captives, hostages as leverage to enforce or ensure loyalty on the part of whoever it was that was sitting on the Judean throne at the time. And at this point, God speaks through his prophets, Daniel among others, saying, stop trying to find your security in yourself. Come to me, look to me as you once did, and I will rescue you. Well, the people ignored it, the king ignored it, and decided to try and throw off the Babylonian yoke all on their own through various political intrigue and outright rebellion, which then made Nebuchadnezzar mad, and so he brings the army in a second time, and they then force a much larger deportation. They take the majority of the Judean people away from their homeland and replant them within the Babylonian geographic footprint. And at this point, Ezekiel is taken in the second wave of deportation. So Ezekiel is speaking in a time right after he has been deported, but before the third and final wave comes, and that's after this great deportation. God, through Ezekiel among others, we'll see in this vision, through Ezekiel and others, calls the people to return to righteousness, return to me, seek your safety and your oneness with me, and I will redeem you, I will save you, I will bring you home. And the people refuse. They continue doing as they always have, and again they try on their own, without God's help, to try and rid themselves of Babylonian overlordship, which is the final straw for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar then brings the full weight of the army, and they completely destroy the city of Jerusalem. They completely destroy the temple. They had already plundered the temple of all of its riches as kind of a twisting of the knife with the deportation. But the temple at that point still stood, Solomon's temple. Well, at this point, the Babylonians come and they completely burn it all to the ground. Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside are left a complete wasteland, and only a small remnant of people are left to try and scratch a living off the rocks as best they can. And so here, in the midst of all of this, God keeps saying, return to me and I will save you. And Ezekiel's message, the message that we are about to read, occurs between that second great deportation, but before the army comes a third time and completely destroys the city. This is will be in Ezekiel chapter 8. This is called the Vision of the Temple. And I'll read chapter 8, verses 5 through 10. I invite you to read along with me. And when I'm finished, I'll say, this is the word of the Lord, so that if you, at that point, I invite you, if you would like to respond in faith, by saying, thanks be to God. But listen carefully. We are reading the holy word of the Lord together. Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 5 through 10. Then God said to me, O mortal, lift up your eyes now in the direction of the north. So I lifted up my eyes toward the north, and there, north of the altar gate, in the entrance, was this image of jealousy. He said to me, Mortal, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations in the house that the house of Israel is committing here, to drive me far away from my sanctuary. Yet you will see still greater abominations. And he brought me to the entrance of the court. I looked, and there was a hole in the wall. And he said to me, Mortal, dig through the wall. And when I dug through the wall, there was an entrance. He said to me, "Go in, see the vile abominations they are committing here." So I went in and looked, and there portrayed on the wall all around were all kinds of creeping things and loathsome animals and all the idols of the house of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The grass withers and the flower fades, but these words that we have read together shall endure forever. Well, this is a hard word. This is a difficult vision to have, and even more difficult to try and make sense of. But again, the important thing that we need to remember about this vision is that God gives this vision to Ezekiel before the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, before it's too late. Ezekiel had been removed to a Babylonian province, not the capital of Babylon, but to a different province. But within the Babylonian Empire, they had their version of a mail service, and so word was able to travel between all the various Hebrew enclaves, and also correspondence was possible with their with their kindred who had remained in the homeland. This is what is possible. This is why it's possible for Jeremiah to have spoken both to the people who were there and to the people who were in Babylon at the same time. But God sends this vision to Ezekiel because in this in-between space, false rumors had started to circulate, probably inspired by the people who loved doing the wicked things in God's temple. That they had started these rumors that God had promised to bring the people back and to crush the Babylonian Empire, and it was going to happen tomorrow. And so, let's all get ready because we are, after all, the better people, and God is now going to finally get involved and put these Babylonians down and bring us back home. In the meantime, they are still worshiping other gods, false gods, in the very temple itself in Jerusalem. You see, these abominations that we see in this vision, the vision of the abominations in the temple, are not necessarily physical abominations. Don't think of like really nasty horror films when God is doing this. These are relational abominations. I think to think about it, to understand it from God's perspective, I think a good kind of pop culture image that we might have, although it's somewhat dated now, is my favorite Christmas rom-com, Love Actually. Every Christmas I love to watch the movie Love Actually, and it's a great film, but in order for the film to work out, there has to be a crisis. And so there are a number of central characters who have a crisis, and one of them is the gentleman who at the very beginning of the film, we see him kissing his wife goodbye, and he runs out the door of their house in London, where he's going to go a couple blocks down and attend the funeral of a dear friend. Well, he attends the funeral, but then between the ending of the funeral and the beginning of the reception, he realizes he forgot something, and so he nips back to the house to pick up what he had accidentally left behind, and he walks in to discover that his wife and his brother are having an affair while he's away at his friend's funeral. And to make matters worse, they're doing it in their own bedroom. So thinking about this from God's perspective, when we worship other gods, when we chase other gods, it is akin in the heart of God to being cheated on by a spouse. And imagine in your own house, if you walked in to find your beloved other having an affair in your own bedroom, you would never want to walk into that house again. And of course, God tells the people that this is happening. God gives them this vision so that they can change their ways. It's not too late yet that you can change your ways, and yet they choose not to change their ways. They persist, they double down on their wickedness, which then facilitates the great destruction of the city. Not because God has chosen to smite the city, but because they keep choosing to refuse God's protection, and his protection is the only protection that actually works when you're a nation as small and vulnerable as Israel was. So, of course, all of this begs the question, it's a great history lesson, of course, but all of this begs the question of how does that relate to us today? I mean, we are on the far side of the resurrection, so what does this have anything to do with those of us who know that we are saved by grace and grace alone through faith? How can we as Christians harmonize or reconcile what we see here with the full character of God we see revealed in the person of Jesus Christ? Well, I have a couple of short, brief reflections that I think might be helpful, at least that I find helpful for understanding this. And my first reflection is this, that this vision that Ezekiel is given and the message that comes along with it, and then what comes to pass after this word is disregarded, is for us Christians should be, on a grand cosmic or at least on a national geopolitical stage, this should sound very familiar to us as Christians for what we experience on a personal level that we just passed through a few weeks ago. In other words, this is on a large scale the Good Friday word. This is the next to last word. It's difficult, it's hard, it's deeply unpleasant. And yet it must be said in order for renewal and for healing to happen. We know as Christians that we cannot understand, that we cannot inhabit fully the joy, the resurrection joy of Easter Sunday unless we first understand and know and pass through the necessary condemnation on Good Friday of all that is sin and all that is evil. We also know that there can be no rebirth without death. We know that there is no resurrection without a death happening first. Israel, the northern kingdom at the hands of the Assyrians, and Judah at the hands of Babylon must hear. They had to hear. They needed to hear the definitive, emphatic, divine no pronounced and declared over the wickedness that they had immersed themselves in. Something had to happen to turn hearts and minds back to the living God. And the good news is they did. They turned back to the Lord their God while in captivity, and that facilitated their return. But for us as Christians, we know that we also have to be confronted with, we have to come to grips with our own brokenness in order to understand the grace, the gift of grace that Jesus brings to us and the value of the new life that we have in him. And of course, thanks be to God, the great, emphatic, divine no and its ultimate consequences, both of our own personal folly and all of the folly of the entire world, has really, truly fallen on the shoulders of someone else and not on us. But in order for us to understand that value, we have to hear that no word and understand its weight. And then when we see it being bestowed on someone else, now we are grateful. My second reflection is that what God is doing here in Ezekiel's time is very similar to a story from our time that I once heard. I don't know if this is a true story or just an urban legend, but so I'll tell it as a parable, and you can decide for yourself whether you want it to be actual fact or not. But the story I heard is of a mother who discovers that who knows that her son has committed a very serious crime. A very serious crime. Not petty shoplifting, but something much worse. And this son assumes that his mother is going to cover for him. That she's going to cover up for him, that she'll let him hide out until the heat blows over, and because she's his mother and she loves him. And so he assumes that that's what she'll do. But this mother, being a loving mother and being willing and able to engage in what we would call tough love, gives her son an ultimatum. You have two choices, son. Either I call the police right now and you get taken off to jail to face the justice that you deserve, or you and I can go together to the police station and you can turn yourself in. And then, of course, as this story goes, that she drives him to the police station. She holds his hand as he confesses to what he did. She attends all the hearings involved in the case where then sentence is passed upon him. She visits him and calls him when he is in prison. In other words, she does not leave him, even though he is geographically, physically separated from her. She never leaves him. And her love never departs from him, even though the love at times has to be tough. Well, the same is true for us. What we can learn from this story is that God does not abandon Judah. God does not abandon his people, even though they are physically removed from their homeland in this land of foreigners. God continues to be with the people. God continues to be with his people. In fact, there are more prophets actively speaking the legitimate word of God in this era in Israel's history, or in Judah's history also, than there is anywhere else in the Old Testament. The temple is gone. The priests are corrupt. But God has not departed. God is now speaking through the prophets. And indeed, this vision culminates with God's glory departing from the temple. Because after all, when somebody's committing adultery in your own house, why would you ever want to go back in? But there's a difference between God's glory leaving the temple and God personally leaving the people. Yes, God's glory may leave a building, but God himself never leaves us. And indeed, we'll touch more on that with the vision we come to next week. But as God's children, I'm sure that I'm not alone in this. When God's children, when we come face to face with the gravity of our sin, and we know that we have gravely sinned, and we're convicted by that, there may be moments in our hearts and in our minds when we wonder if God has turned his back on us. And even if it's not in the face of our own sin, there might be times when we feel like God is distant from us, that God has turned his back, and we wonder, gosh, what have I done that God would do such a thing? But the truth is, even in Babylon, even in nasty, heathen-filled Babylon, God was there. God never left his people. And in our time, we have the Holy Spirit alive in each and every one of us. And even though we might feel like we're distant from God, the simple truth is we know beyond all doubt that God does not leave us either. That abandonment just simply is not in God's nature. And in fact, in the face of sin in Ezekiel's time, God doubles down on his steadfast love for his people. And we'll see that start to take shape next week. But we know in our time, God doubles down in the face of our sin. God doubles down on his steadfast, abiding love for us in the person of Jesus Christ. We love John 3:16, every single one. We all know John 3:16 in our hearts, and we love it. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son. And that's very true, and it's wonderful, but what comes right alongside of John 3:16 is John 3:17, which is just as good for us to remember. And that is, our Lord says, for the Son came into the world not to condemn the world, but so the world might be saved through him. God was already beginning this process of preparing the way for the Son to come into the world, not for condemnation, but so the world might be saved. That is already even beginning, even as the Israelites refuse to turn toward the Lord and as they face the destruction of their city. And so I invite you to come back next week. Come back next week where we begin seeing visions that God gives of what's going to happen next. We have heard the next to last word today. I invite you back next week where we can begin to hear the forecho of the final word that will be spoken in Jesus Christ. Amen? Amen.